I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 2. Final Gasp. San Jose de las Lajas, Cuba. Staff Sergeant Haverty of India Company, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, sat next to the Lance Corporal's computer as he controlled the small scout drone they were using. The Marine had a visual reality headset on and a small controller in his right hand that looked something like a Wii game controller. He was moving the scout drone ahead of their position to locate the Russian unit that was currently the last major obstacle between them and moving on Havana. A smile crept across Gunnery Sergeant Mann's face as he, too, watched the computer screen. He gently leaned down and directed the young Marine to go back to a specific set of houses near the highway. "See if you can get a bit closer to that section, will you?" he asked. The little drone headed closer to the cluster of homes. Although the Lance Corporal kept a little bit of distance so as not to have the drone discovered, they were able to spot several groups of Russian soldiers. Leaning against the wall of one of the buildings were 3 RPG launchers. A handful of rockets rested nearby. "Someone write down the grid of this location. We're as close to it as we can get," Gunny Man said, speaking to no one in particular. They did a bit more scouting of the area and wrote down a few more sets of coordinates where the enemy was hiding. Their lieutenant walked up to them. "How's it going?" he asked. They showed the LT a few of the pictures they had taken with the drone and the exact locations of the trouble in the city. "Let's get an airstrike to hit those coordinates," the LT finally ordered. Gunny Man shook his head. "There are too many civilians in the nearby area to use an airstrike, sir," he explained. "We need to either hit them with the mortars or go root them out ourselves." The LT frowned, but then seemed to realize the gunny was right. "All right. Then let's have that mortar platoon try and take them out. After that, we'll advance on foot and clear this last cluster of resistance." 20 minutes went by as the platoon and the rest of the company moved into position. They also positioned their lavs nearby, so they'd be able to lay down some covering fire when the grunts got themselves into the town and did the dirty work of clearing the enemy out. A day earlier, the battalion had tried to bypass the town using the main highway. However, they'd lost a few tanks when a series of anti-tank guided missiles had been launched at them from the town. Unless they wanted to conduct a serious detour, they needed to clear this town and then move on. Staff Sergeant Haverty and his men approached the town from the southeast, moving swiftly through the wild grass and rows of trees and underbrush. They wanted to get close to the Russian soldiers when the Lavs made their move. That would be the signal for them to bum rush the town. They all kneeled beside a row of trees that placed them roughly 200 meters away from the Russian positions. Their company commander radioed to the Lavs. "We're ready for you," he announced. From somewhere behind them, Haverty heard the thumping sound of the mortar platoon firing their projectiles. He and his fellow Marines waited for the rounds to sail over their heads and explode on the Russians. When the first couple of mortars hit the enemy positions, Haverty heard the whine of the engines of the 6 Lavs, along with the clattering of the tracks of their 2 tanks as they all moved toward the outskirts of the town. A few moments later, he could hear the 25mm gunners open fire. Gunny Man stood up. "That's the signal," he yelled. Man leapt forward, fearless of the enemy soldiers, and sprinted toward the enemy positions. Everyone in the platoon followed him, running for their lives and trying to cover the wide-open space while they had cover from their armored vehicles. 50 meters from the edge of the nearest set of houses, a light machine gun opened fire on them. Bullets hit all around them, a few of them thudding into the chest arms and legs of some of the Marines. As Haverty continued charging forward, he heard several men call out for a corpsman. Slamming himself against the side of a home, Staff Sergeant Haverty did everything in his power to regain control of his breathing. Looking back, he saw 6 of their Marines had been hit. 2 corpsmen were doing their best to render first aid while taking heavy enemy fire. "You 4 with me," Haverty said as he edged forward to look around the side of the house he was using for cover. As he peered around the corner, the area looked clear at the moment. There were 5 more houses, all in a line, and a dirt road that connected this cluster of homes to the rest of the town. Taking a deep breath, Haverty willed himself to leave the safety of this side of the house and head down the alley. The 4 other Marines with him followed his lead. Before he knew it, another 10 Marines had followed them down the alleyway. When they reached the end of it, they spotted 2 homes filled with Russians who were shooting at them. They had part of India Company pinned down with a couple of their PKP machine guns. Staff Sergeant Haverty turned to look back at the Marines behind him. Finally, he spotted what he was looking for. "I need you 2 guys with the SMAWs to hit those buildings with the machine guns in them," he ordered. Eyeing the rest of the Marines nearby, Haverty added, "When they fire their rockets, we need to rush those positions and clear them out." Everyone nodded. The 2 guys with the SMAWs unstrapped them from their rucks and got ready to fire. A few moments later, they jumped out from behind their covered position, unleashed the rockets, and immediately jumped back behind the side of the house they were using for cover. Boom! Boom! Without waiting a second longer, Haverty ran past the edge of the house they had been hiding behind and charged forward. He had his rifle at the ready as he scanned for threats. The other Marines behind him ran to catch up. Less than 60 seconds from the time the SMAWs had hit the building, Haverty and half a dozen other Marines were inside both houses. They shot a couple of Russian soldiers who'd survived the rocket attack and cleared the house. With no more machine gun fire emanating from the 2 buildings, the rest of the company swarmed the town. As the Marines continued to clear the edge of the town near the highway, several of the LAVs and tanks made their way there to provide direct fire support and help them clear the area faster. Meanwhile, the other 2 battalions of Marines that made up their ground force pushed past the town and continued their drive on Havana. The battle for Cuba was nearly over. Chapter 3. Unraveled. White House, Washington, D.C. The Attorney General sat at the table with the heads of the FBI, CIA, NSA, and Homeland Security, waiting to see how the President wanted to proceed. For the last couple of days, the FBI and CIA had been debriefing Roberto Lamy on what had transpired in the Swiss village of St. Moritz several years ago. Mr. Lamy had confirmed to them that a secret plan had been hatched at the meeting to replace the American president with one that was more amenable to the economic wishes of the EU, Russia, and China. Working through their American colleague Lance Solomon, who was now the head of Goldman Sachs, the secret cabal had been introduced to Senator Marshall Tate. The secretive Yale Society, Skull and Bones, which had selected candidates to promote in the past, had set their sights on another one of their members becoming president. Senator Marshall Tate had unknowingly been groomed for most of his life to become a presidential contender one day. However, given the political climate, the international cabal hadn't wanted to take the chance of him not winning. So they developed a plan to rig the results and stage a series of domestic terrorist attacks to distract the government and people from finding out about the postal worker scheme. As video of some of the key interrogations was being played for the president, AG Malcolm Wright declared, "I believe we have enough evidence to convene a grand jury and get them to indict Senator Marshall Tate and his co-conspirators. We just need to figure out how we should convey this information to members of Congress and the American people. They need to know what has transpired, so we can put an end to this growing civil war and finally have a unified fight against the Chinese. President Sachs let the statement hang there for a moment. "Okay, let's convene a grand jury and get the indictments," he finally said. "I think after that, we'll need to have Congress hold a public hearing. We have you and Director Polanski testify and explain everything. Show them the same videos and evidence you've shown me. Once you've done that, have Mr. Lamy come in and provide a statement of what his involvement was in this scheme and what his other co-conspirators' parts were. We need him to provide some context to this scheme and how it all started." The president paused. "I'd really like to get Lamy's take on what the heck the Chinese are doing. It would appear they have some ulterior motive beyond what was originally developed." Leaning forward, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs explained, "We're working that angle as we speak. Right now, it would appear the Chinese used the delay in launching their invasion to allow them more time to build up their ground force in Mexico. That said, it doesn't make any sense militarily why they would have waited to attack us until 3 weeks after the UN force in the north did. By the time they launched their invasion, we had largely defeated the bulk of the UN force." The president's national security advisor chimed in. "I don't have proof of this, so this is just me shooting from the hip. But I think the Chinese held off on attacking us because, yes, they wanted to allow for more time, not just to build up their ground forces in Mexico, but also to give our forces and the UN more time to bludgeon each other. We've largely destroyed the UN army at this point, and that army represents the bulk of the military combat power in Europe and Russia. Who stands to gain from these militaries being largely destroyed? The Chinese." The room was silent for a moment as everyone digested what NSA Gray had just explained. President Sachs finally asked, "You think there's more to all of this than just rigging our election?" "I definitely think there's more than we are currently seeing. From my vantage point, the Chinese saw what was happening in our country before the UN force attacked us, and they modified their plans. They saw the popular uprising against you wasn't forming fast enough to allow the UN to ride in and save the day. Once the UN launched their attack on Washington, D.C., the entire base of support Marshal Tate had been building up evaporated almost overnight. Even the media, which has obviously not been a supporter of yours, turned on Tate when they saw images of the Capitol building and Pentagon burning and foreign soldiers crossing into our country and occupying American cities." CIA Director Marcus Ryerson spoke up. "Then how do you explain the Chinese cruise missile attack during the opening day of the war? They didn't hold back when they attacked us with those merchant raiders. They really hurt us bad with those." "Simple," Gray responded. "They had the element of surprise on their side, and in that moment, they knew they could hurt both our Air Force and Navy if they unleashed their surprise attack. Had they waited even a day, most of those combat aircraft they blew up would have been shifted north to deal with the UN, and they would have lost the opportunity to hit them while they were still exposed on parking ramps on our southern bases. Furthermore, they knew the carrier strike groups would have been more alert to their actions the longer they waited. I think they saw the opportunity to hurt us, and they took it." "Okay, but why nuke Guam, Arizona, and Oklahoma?" Ryerson countered. "Why hit Pine Gap and San Diego with an EMP? And why use nuclear weapons on our carrier strike groups? They had to know we'd retaliate, and last time I checked, we've effectively wiped out probably close to 80 or 90% of their nuclear weapons capability." "Director Ryerson, from a military standpoint, this was an exceptional exchange for them," NSA Gray asserted. "Although they lost the bulk of their nuclear weapons and missiles, they didn't lose their ability to build more at a later date. Rather, they exchanged a weapon system they know they can't use in this war. They traded the bulk of their existing nuclear weapons capability for removing our naval and air base on Guam, destroying an entire carrier strike group, wiping out one of 3 army formations we had along the southern border, and crippling our only military force in California that could stop them. To add further insult to injury, that nuke that hit Oklahoma destroyed more than 30% of our military's munition reserves. We're also incredibly fortunate the missiles headed to Texas were intercepted, or there's a good likelihood the Chinese would have captured all of our border states and be in position to threaten the entire heartland of our country. Trying to regain control of the meeting, Attorney General Wright exclaimed, "Mr. President, this is why it's important that we brief Congress and get Mr. Lamy to testify before them. The sooner we can expose this corrupt plot to our own people and the rest of the world, the sooner we'll be able to get control of things in our own country and focus our military's entire attention on the Chinese. I'm pretty confident that once the people of Europe learn they were lied to, they will turn on their leaders for leading them into this war. They will demand an end to the fighting. When that happens, we can have those forces moved to fight the Chinese." The president nodded. By the end of the meeting, there were plans to impanel a grand jury as soon as the next morning. Then they'd seek to get the indictments issued. After that, they'd brief both houses of Congress on what they had learned up to that point and bring to light the entire scheme to defraud the world. Chapter 4. Consequences. Geneva, Switzerland, United Nations Headquarters. Johann Baer couldn't believe what he was reading. It didn't seem possible that the Brazilians had really let the Americans escape with Roberto. But the thought that continued to plague him the most was, how could Roberto have betrayed us like this? His secretary popped in the door. "Sir, General Mackenzie is on the secured video teleconference," she announced. Johann looked up at the beautiful woman before him and wondered where her loyalties were now. Were they with him, or the German BND and her host nation government? Hell, I'm German too, he realized. Although since taking charge of the UN, he had viewed himself more as a global citizen. "Thank you," he finally said. Then Johann got up and walked over to the side conference room with the video monitors. When he entered the room, he saw his military commander. "General Mackenzie, how are things going on your end?" Johann asked, hoping the alliance wasn't unraveling on him just yet. Mackenzie shook his head. "Not good, sir. It pains me to report this, but several of my coalition partners have just informed me that their nations have ordered them home. They are either to extract themselves from the fighting or surrender in place to the Americans." Johann sat in stunned silence for a moment. "This is happening faster than I thought it would." "Which members are throwing in the towel?" he grumbled. "Let's just say it'd be easier to list who's still willing to fight," General Mackenzie replied with a grunt. "Right now, I'm left with the Norwegians, Russians, French, and Germans. But to be honest, I don't know that they'll all be willing to fight much longer." Johann sighed. "General Mackenzie, if your own government is withdrawing from the peacekeeping mission, how does that impact our operations? In particular, you?" "I've made my bed, sir. I'm in this for the long haul," Mackenzie answered. "However, the Canadian government is now demanding that the UN take its military force and leave. They are no longer going to provide any support to us. In fact, they've ordered the entire Canadian armed forces to surrender to the Americans. A handful of key military officers and I have refused that order." Johann shook his head in dismay. He couldn't believe things were imploding around him so hastily. The Americans had made a very public spectacle of Roberto's testimony before their legislature. Roberto had sung like a canary, begging not to be eaten by a cat. He'd revealed their entire plan, how they were going to rig the election, who they had selected to be their candidate, and how they had planned on returning America and the world to the old order of being managed and ruled by the global oligarchy. The calls for Johann's own resignation were ringing louder and louder each day. He wasn't even sure how long he'd be able to remain the UN Secretary General if something didn't change soon. Johann looked back at his general, who sat dutifully awaiting his next set of orders. "What are our options at this point, General?" he asked. "Can the mission continue?" Mackenzie quietly took a minute to think. Finally, he replied, "Sir, I'm a soldier. If you tell me to fight on, I'll do my best to fight on." He paused for a second, as if contemplating whether he should say something else or not. "Sir, as the commander of the UN peacekeeping force, I'm also responsible for tens of thousands of lives. I'd be derelict in my duties if I didn't make you aware of some critical problems we're going to face. Will you allow me the opportunity to explain?" Johann could see the conflicting feelings in the man's face, even through the computer screen. He nodded for him to go ahead. "My force is demoralized," Mackenzie admitted. "Several of my key military groups have withdrawn from the war or are in the process of surrendering. This is going to have the effect of a rapidly spreading contagion on my remaining force. I can direct what forces I have to continue to fight, but we can't win. We'll be sacrificing the lives of our men and women in a war they have no hope of winning. Many of my soldiers know that, which means they won't fight as hard as they would have when they thought victory was on the horizon. As more of them learn of Mr. Lammy's betrayal and what he told the world, many more will either surrender outright or they'll refuse to fight. My advice as your military commander, sir, is that you order us to surrender. Save the lives of our remaining forces so they can return home to see their families." Lifting his head up to look at the ceiling, Johann let out a long sigh. Returning his gaze to his general, he asked, "What about the insurgency that is finally taking root in America? The American militia forces are getting themselves mobilized and seizing power. What will happen to them if we just up and surrender?" General Mackenzie nodded. "I have thought about that as well, sir," he replied. "Our surrender will hurt them, but it won't cripple them. What I propose is that we hand over the vast majority of our weapons and munitions to these militia forces. They can use the equipment we'll be abandoning to carry on the fight without us. America is a big country. We've started the fire of civil war, and we've fanned the flames for nearly 6 months. Now we can sit back and let it burn the country to the ground." "What about China? They've effectively pulled out of our peacekeeping mission, but they're continuing to fight. How will this impact them?" Mackenzie shrugged his shoulders. "Frankly, I don't care. We're in this situation because the Chinese were apparently playing their own angle in this war. I'm not sure what kind of plans or agenda they had, but it certainly wasn't to coordinate and work with us. They essentially left us high and dry right when we needed them the most. At this point, I hope the Americans crush them." "I think you're right about them having an ulterior agenda," Johann agreed. He popped the knuckles on his right hand. "But what exactly is going to happen to President Tate?" "I have no idea," Mackenzie replied, shrugging. "I know my government has withdrawn their support of him. They've also said he's not welcome in Canada. No one from his exiled government is. I hear they set up a temporary capital in Boston." He sighed again. "Sir, I recommend we surrender. Do you accept my recommendation?" Johann sat back in his chair for a moment. "I wonder if this is how Hitler felt at the end," he thought. He asked himself how he could have ended up in the same position as that monster. It felt as though the Russians were at the gates of Berlin and the Allies were closing in from the west. But Jonathan Sachs is the monster. He's Hitler, not me. "General, part of me obviously wants you to fight on, but I also recognize that we can't win, and that course of action will only cost us more lives. So here's what I want you to do. Before you surrender your force, do your best to distribute your weapons and what munitions and supplies you have to the Civil Defense Forces. If we can't carry on the fight, then I want to make sure we do whatever we can to make sure they can." The two of them talked for another 5 minutes before Johann ended the call. He wasn't sure if or when he'd be able to speak with General Mackenzie again, but he was eternally grateful for all he'd done. Johann got up from his chair and made his way to his office in the next room, where his secretary, Monica, stood waiting for him, a grim expression on her face. "Sir, I just received a message from President Gloria Uribe," Monica announced. "She said to inform you that an emergency meeting of the General Assembly is being called. Tomorrow morning, she's going to introduce a resolution to have the UN peacekeeping mission disbanded and have you removed from office." Johann felt like he had been punched in the gut, and then he started to feel a little lightheaded. Seeing him get a little wobbly, Monica moved over to help him. She gently guided him over to the couch, where he sat down. "Let me get you a drink, sir," she said. She made her way over to his desk and grabbed the glass decanter of Zwetschgenwasser, Johann's favorite plum brandy. She filled one of the matching glass tumblers, then turned around to hand it to him. When she handed him the drink, she leaned over a bit, and Johann couldn't help but notice her cleavage practically spilling out above the neckline of her V-neck sweater. He forced himself to look up to her eyeline, and she smiled at him coyly. "Here you go, sir. Drink this," she said. "It'll help settle your stomach. We'll sort this out together." My God, is she really flirting with me? Johann thought, wondering if his hidden desires were about to be fulfilled. He nodded and reached for the tumbler. "Thank you, Monica. I'm a bit of a sucker for a good plum brandy," he told her, as if she hadn't already heard this story. "My grandfather used to drink this when he had to think on a tough decision." He sighed again, thinking of all that was transpiring around him. His entire world was falling apart. Well, everything except his drink and his gorgeous secretary who was sitting next to him. "Oh my, where are my manners?" he asked aloud. "Please pour yourself one and let's talk, Monica." She smiled again. "That's very nice of you, sir. Let me do that." She stood up and walked back to his desk. Oh my God, is she shaking her hips more than usual? Johann wondered. His face flushed. As she sat down to pour herself a glass, he lifted the tumbler to his lips and downed the whole glass. She laughed. "How about I just bring the whole decanter and we finish it off?" she asked flirtatiously. Johann chuckled. "That sounds great." Before he could finish his sentence, a strange expression washed over his face. Then the tumbler fell from his hands, and he sank down into the couch. Monica walked over to him. She sat down next to him as his eyes drifted off into space, his expression almost blank. She pulled out the eyedropper she'd used in her boss's drink, then squeezed a few more drops into his now open mouth. She walked back to the desk where she'd left the decanter and tumbler. She filled a glass and downed it, then filled it up again and downed a second drink. She could see Johann's lips turning blue, which was followed by a gurgling sound as he struggled to breathe. She knew his body was overdosing on the fentanyl she had given him. It wouldn't be long until he was dead. Johann seemed to have a seizure, and then his body went stiff. She waited a minute, then checked his pulse. Once she confirmed that he was gone, she sent a message back to her handlers in Berlin. They had been adamant that he had to be taken out. The Chancellor had felt betrayed by Johann, and her own party was ready to crucify her. She needed to extricate Germany from this disastrous war and do her best to eat humble pie. The best way to do that was to place all the blame on the UN Secretary General, who, according to the news reports that went out later that day, had chosen to take his own life rather than be arrested. Chapter 5. Q Project. Naval Air Station, Coronado, San Diego, California. General Han Lei sat in an office that used to be occupied by a U.S. naval admiral before he'd abandoned it along with the rest of the naval bases. Across the table from him was Vice Admiral Hu Zanshu, who appeared to be reveling in the fact that he was sitting in a most coveted U.S. naval position. The office had a beautiful view of the surrounding area. With the windows opened, a nice breeze wafted in, carrying the smell of saltwater air, and they could hear the sounds of the seagulls outside. General Han, however, was not impressed. He preferred a more utilitarian office, one that was devoid of such niceties. He believed these luxuries made a person soft. Unlike some of his fellow generals and admirals, he didn't view command as a job that should come with special perks and privileges, but as one that should be held in high regard and should focus on how one could better serve the state. Han looked pointedly at his naval counterpart. "Admiral, is your force going to be able to keep the sea lanes open so my army can stay supplied?" he asked. Hu narrowed his eyes at the possible accusation. "China has suffered greatly to ensure your army will be able to stay supplied," he answered icily. "I have every advantage to make sure it stays supplied and will be able to achieve victory. The bigger question I have is how will your forces hold up against the Americans now that the UN peacekeeping mission in the north has collapsed?" General Han smiled at the probing inquiry. He had anticipated this line of questioning and had come prepared. "I would not be worried about the Americans, Admiral," he explained. "Our plan to have the Europeans and Americans bash each other's armies apart has worked better than we thought possible. Their army and air force has been seriously degraded. They've also lost a significant portion of their industrial capability in the Midwest and the Northeast. It is going to take them time to rebuild, time they do not have." Han crossed his arms. "When will the 16th, 26th, and 39th Army groups arrive?" he grilled. Han needed those other 3 army groups now. He had achieved a temporary breakthrough here in California, but his offensive in Arizona and New Mexico had stalled. The Americans had also halted his attack in Texas. Those 3 additional army groups would more than double his current force, and should be enough for him to finish capturing California, Oregon, Arizona, and Nevada. If he ended up losing Texas and New Mexico, but was able to hold on to those other 4 states, that would still constitute a win in his eyes, and in President Chen's. "The 16th will arrive in San Diego tomorrow. The 26th and 39th will arrive in L.A. over the next 5 days," Admiral Hu answered. "Are you sure you want me to still use the ports in L.A.? It's going to put my ships pretty close to the front lines." "Are you afraid your sailors might have to see some combat, Admiral?" Han said, a mischievous smile curling on the left side of his face. Hu shook his head. "No. I'm afraid I may lose some valuable ships that I can't afford to lose because you want to place them in unneeded danger," he responded. "I'm having you offload them in L.A. because it puts them closer to the front lines so I can throw them into the battle sooner," General Han explained, speaking as if instructing a school child. "The Marines and a small contingent of California Army National Guardsmen are all that stands between us capturing the entire lower half of California. I have a finite amount of time to secure the state before the Americans are able to reposition their forces from the East Coast to the West Coast. That's why I'm having you offload them in L.A. Han was annoyed at the questioning of his tactics. "Let's change topics, General," said Admiral Hu. "Once my ships are offloaded in L.A., Do you want the cargo and troop ships to be brought back down here to San Diego, to be loaded up with people for the Q program?" Han nodded. Although he didn't particularly care for this part of the job, he was doing his part for the Q program, just as his political officer had demanded. "Yes, we have 30,000 women who need to be transported back to China for the program." "Why not fly them back?" Admiral Hu asked. "It would take less time, and then my men wouldn't be distracted by having them on our ships." General Han sighed at the question. He'd asked it himself many times before. "If I could fly them all out, I would. As it stands, I've only been allocated 10 aircraft a day for the program. That means I can only transport 3,230 people a day. As it stands, the political officers are identifying nearly twice that number a day. I can't support and feed that many extra mouths and my army at the same time." Admiral Hu shook his head. Leaning forward and speaking in a hushed tone, he said, "This entire program is wrong, Han. When word gets out about what's going on, it's not only going to turn the locals on us, it's going to turn the rest of the world against us as well." General Han also leaned in before he replied, "I have no say in this, Admiral. The political officers have been given the task by the President, and he's directed me to cooperate. The sad part is, this is only the first step. Phase 2 is supposed to start next month." Hu's left eyebrow rose. "Phase 2? What's that?" Han felt his expression sour. "Something I nearly lost my command over when I voiced my opposition," he answered. "Let's just say, this won't bode well for any of us if we don't win this war, Admiral." Admiral Hu snorted at the vague response. "Then we best not lose, General Han." Mandeville Canyon Park, just north of Los Angeles. Staff Sergeant Mack of Regimental Combat Team 1 held his hand up and closed his fist into a ball. Then he lowered his arm. Turning briefly to look behind him, he saw his squad had taken a knee, ready for whatever may come their way. Returning his gaze to his front, Mack breathed slowly and quietly as he tried to use all of his senses to hear for something in front of him. A few seconds ago, he thought he'd heard a tree branch snap. His eyes darted from one clump of trees and bushes to another as he looked for the source of the noise. It was now nearly summer, and the forest had returned to life. Branches were full of leaves and flowers, and animals roamed the woods. Was it just a squirrel? He wondered. Lieutenant Ray Ambrose stealthily moved up a few feet behind him. In a barely audible whisper, he asked, "What did you hear?" Mac turned slightly to his side. "I think I heard a twig or branch break," he murmured. The lieutenant turned around to face the rest of the squad and used a hand signal to tell them to spread out to form a line formation abreast of him and Mac. The squad spread out quietly, rifles at the ready, waiting for a possible ambush. The squad behind them also spread out as they moved forward to reinforce First Squad. Third and Fourth Squads would stay in reserve until they figured out what they were facing in the dark. It was nearly dawn. They had sent a drone over the area the day before, and it had found a sizable element of Chinese infantry moving into Mandeville Park, just west of the Los Angeles neighborhoods of Westwood and Brentwood Heights. The PLA was aggressively expanding their perimeter beyond the city of LA as they sought to press home their numerical advantage over the Marines and the lone California Army National Guard Brigade fighting alongside them. While the sun hadn't crested the ridgeline and canyon yet, the pre-dawn light was slowly pushing away the darkness. However, as he glanced up, Staff Sergeant Mack could still make out some of the brighter stars in the sky above. Then he noticed that the birds had stopped chirping their morning melody. When did they stop singing? He wondered. He didn't know how long they'd been silent, and he asked himself how badly he was messing up. Seconds after he noticed the absence of the birds, Sergeant Mack spotted a flare as it shot up through the trees. It burst open and began its slow journey back to the ground, illuminating the forest around them in an eerie artificial light that danced off the trees and vegetation. Then Mack heard the unmistakable loud shriek of a PLA officer's whistle, ordering his soldiers forward. "Contact front!" he screamed instinctively. Then he fired into a group of bushes where he saw movement. Mack fired off maybe 3 or 4 rounds before he dove behind a depression next to the hiking trail. A string of tracer rounds and bullets hit right where he'd just been, ripping apart several smaller trees and bushes. Lieutenant Ambrose, who had also dived for cover, only in the opposite direction, shouted into his radio headset. "Move forward!" he directed the rest of the platoon. "We need your help!" Mack looked to his left and right. His squad reacted just as they had trained. They were all seeking out good cover, firing a handful of shots, and then moving to a different position. Explosions started happening around their positions as several mortar rounds landed nearby, throwing more shrapnel into the air and shredding some of the new undergrowth. "I'm hit! Corpsman! Corpsman!" shouted one of his Marines. "First squad, grenades!" Staff Sergeant Mack yelled. Crump, crump, crump. A handful of grenades exploded to their front as his squad followed his orders and lobbed them at the wall of enemy soldiers charging towards them. "Alpha Team, advance! Bravo Team, covering fire!" Mack screamed. He always felt that the best way out of an ambush was to charge it. It was the last thing an enemy would be expecting. Sergeant Mack jumped up, raised his rifle to his shoulder, and dashed forward with his Alpha Team. As he raced through the trees, he spotted several Chinese soldiers who appeared completely surprised and caught off guard by the Marines' sudden charge and their screams like men possessed. Before Bravo Team even had a chance to charge forward, Mack and Alpha Team were already on top of the PLA soldiers. Sergeant Mack spotted a group of 4 Chinese soldiers manning a Type 80 general-purpose machine gun, or MG for short. Leveling his rifle at the shocked soldiers, Mack fired relentlessly at them until he saw all 4 of them dead or incapacitated. Jumping down into the enemy fighting position, he dropped his empty magazine, grabbed a fresh mag, and slapped it in place. Then he hit the bolt release, ramming a fresh round into the chamber. Looking around him, Mack realized he was the only Marine on this side of the enemy line. He heard a lot of shouting, screaming, and shooting coming from further down the line, and Bravo Team was advancing forward now. Mack ran toward the loudest screaming and yelling and found one of his Marines rolling on the ground, fighting with a Chinese soldier who was doing his best to drive his knife into the young Marine's chest. Mack swooped in and kicked the Chinese soldier in the side of ribs and followed that blow with a swift kick to the side of his head. The blunt force caused the enemy soldier to lose his grip on his Marine, and his brother-in-arms was able to throw the Chinese soldier off himself. Once the enemy soldier was clear of his Marine, Mack fired 3 rounds into the man's chest and face, killing him. The Marine looked simultaneously relieved that Mack had helped him out and terrified that he'd nearly died. "Grab your rifle and keep shooting," Mack shouted. Sergeant Mack heard the sound of another machine gun banging away at the rest of their platoon, and more cries for a corpsman. He advanced along the top of the ridgeline and spotted a cluster of 4 PLA soldiers. 2 of them were manning another MG, while a third guy fired his QBZ-95 assault rifle. The 4th guy was talking on a radio, presumably calling either for reinforcements or for some artillery or air support. In either case, he needed to be taken out. Mack dropped down to a knee as he settled in against the side of a tree. He aimed at the officer first and fired several rounds at the man. He saw one of his rounds hit the side of the man's face and the radio receiver he'd been using. The soldier grabbed at his face with his one good hand as he fell to the ground. The PLA soldier nearest him tried to render first aid, pulling a bandage from the wounded officer's body armor. Mack almost felt bad about killing the soldier trying to render aid, but he swiftly pushed those thoughts out of his mind. He fired a single round, hitting the man in the head and killing him instantly. Mac was only about 30 or 40 meters away now. He zeroed in on the 2 soldiers firing the MG next. After flicking the switch from semi to 3-round burst, Mac squeezed the trigger. He adjusted his aim a fraction of a degree to the left and squeezed the trigger again. With just 2 pulls of his trigger, he'd taken out a second machine gun position. "Don't shoot! We're coming up on your 6!" shouted one of the Marines from Bravo Team. Mac turned around as several Marines ran past him and took up positions on the top of the ridgeline. The lieutenant came up next, with 2nd Squad right behind him. Some of the Marines had already turned the enemy machine gun around to face the Chinese lines as they prepared it for the next attack. Lieutenant Ambrose walked up to him as more Marines ran past them to secure the enemy position. "Staff Sergeant, that was outstanding. I don't think I've ever seen a counter-ambush like that. Now see if you can get the rest of your squad fanned out along that position over there," he said, as he pointed to a position higher up on a nearby hill. That location would provide them with a better vantage point to help cover the ridgeline. Sergeant Mac nodded. He couldn't help but think that the PLA soldiers should have positioned one of the MG teams up there. It would have been a lot harder taking this ridgeline had they done it. Mac called out to his squad and pointed at the hilltop. They trudged up toward that position, trading shots with a few PLA soldiers along the way, as the enemy had fallen back to another position further away. As they continued to move, Mac heard the sound of incoming artillery. Boom, boom, boom. Trees, dirt, and rocks were thrown into the air as the 152mm artillery rounds began to land along the ridgeline his squad had just captured. For the next 5 minutes, the area was hit with a variety of artillery and mortar rounds. Mac kept pushing his squad to get to the top of the hill and get their own light machine guns set up on the high ground. He knew that when the barrage lifted, another wave of infantry would charge forward and attempt to throw them back. As soon as they crested the hill, Mac's eyes went wide as saucers. 30 or 40 PLA soldiers were there, attempting to capture the position for themselves so they could lay waste to the Marines below. Bringing his rifle to his shoulder, Mac fired practically point-blank into the attackers. One of the soldiers following behind him opened fire with his M240, cutting down enemy soldiers like a scythe. Another Marine opened fire with his M27, while a third Marine fired his M203 grenade gun into a cluster of Chinese soldiers. Bullets flew right back at the Marines as the enemy reacted to the sudden appearance of the 11 leathernecks that had beaten them to the top of the hill. Mac felt something hit him in the chest, and it threw him against a tree trunk behind him. Before he could move, he felt several more jackhammers slam into his chest. His knees went weak, and he slumped down on the tree until he was sitting against it, stunned and unsure of what had just happened to him. All he knew for certain was that his lungs were on fire, screaming for oxygen. Finally, his body stopped spasming, and he was able to take a deep breath. He gasped for air a second time when his brain snapped him out of whatever fog he had been in. "I have to keep firing at the enemy or I'm dead," he determined. Reaching down, Mac grabbed the rifle, which he'd involuntarily dropped. He noticed the bolt was in the open position, letting him know his magazine was empty. Before he could replace the mag, several Chinese soldiers saw him slumped against a tree and started running right toward him. Sergeant Mac reached down and grabbed for his Sig Sauer. Pulling the pistol up, he fired several rounds at the enemy soldiers charging towards him. To his surprise, he dropped both attackers with his first couple of shots. Holstering his pistol, he slapped another magazine in his rifle and got up. He moved to the opposite side of the crest of the hill, where several of his Marines were shooting at enemy soldiers. Another group of Chinese soldiers was doing their best to fire and cover each other as they advanced. "Take those guys out!" Mac yelled to the nearby Marines. Several of them turned their machine gun on the attackers, and the M240 gunner fired several controlled bursts at the enemy soldiers. "Incoming!" screamed a nearby Marine. The young man grabbed the live grenade that had just landed right next to him and lobbed it right back at the enemy. Bang! Unfortunately, The grenade went off in the air, maybe a few feet away from the Marine, blowing most of the man's arm off and hitting his face and upper torso with shrapnel. The young man fell backwards, screaming in agony and pain as he saw the now bloody stump of what was left of his arm. With each heartbeat, a large volume of blood shot out of his body. Mac ran to the young Marine and placed his rifle down next to him as he grabbed for the guy's tourniquet. He placed it a couple inches above the wound. Looking the man in the eye, he explained, "This is going to hurt, but I have to tie this bleeder off or you're going to die." The young man just nodded through gritted teeth. Mac tightened the tourniquet on his arm. As he tied it tighter, the man let out a few shouts in pain, but eventually, Mac saw the blood stop squirting out with each heartbeat. Once it was sufficiently tight, Mac helped to prop the Marine up against a tree and handed him his Sig Sauer. "Keep shooting at anyone you think you can hit. Don't lose my pistol, or I'll have your ass. Here's my other 2 mags in case you need them." With nothing more he could do for the wounded man, Sergeant Mac grabbed his rifle and went back to killing the attackers that were trying to dislodge them from the top of the hill. Mac looked to his right. 2 of his Marines lay on the ground, motionless. 3 others were still shooting at the enemy. To his left, he saw another Marine sprawled on the ground and 2 more who appeared to be wounded but were doing their best to stay in the fight. Behind them, the PLA was still hammering the ridgeline with artillery fire. One by one, the ground and airburst artillery rounds tore the area apart. How the hell are any of our guys going to survive this maelstrom? Mac wondered. He grabbed one of his grenades, pulled the pin, and threw it down into a group of 3 enemy soldiers who were trying to sneak around a boulder to get a better angle at his men. Crump! The grenade went off, killing one of the soldiers and wounding the other 2. Aiming his rifle at them, Mac fired several rounds, killing the wounded men before they could return fire at him. Then he heard the best sound he'd heard all day. Artillery landing amongst the attackers. 6 friendly 105mm rounds landed amongst the enemy positions, wiping out the next wave of Chinese soldiers. "Staff Sergeant Mac, if you can hear me, you need to get your squad off that hill," Lieutenant Ambrose said over the radio. "The company is being pulled back before we're outflanked and cut off. Do you hear me, Mac?" Hitting his talk button on his platoon radio, Mac responded, "Copy that, sir. I've got several wounded guys up here. Please provide us with some covering fire while we get down from here." Mac called out to his remaining squad members to pull back. Several of them grabbed their wounded comrades as they began the trek down the hill. Seeing that he was still pretty close to the Marine who had lost his arm, Mac crept back over to him. "I'm going to help you get out of here. We've been ordered to pull out," he announced. Sergeant Mac reached down and picked the Marine up, throwing the man's good arm over his shoulder. He did his best to help guide them down the hill to the rest of their platoon. For the next 20 minutes, friendly artillery pounded the enemy position with high explosive rounds intermixed with smoke rounds to help cover their retreat. It took them nearly an hour to get out of the area. When they finally came back to the parking lot where several of their vehicles were located, Mac was able to get a corpsman to take a look at his wounded Marine. In less than a minute, the injured young man had been given a shot of morphine and an IV had been started for him. Sergeant Mac and the corpsman loaded him into one of the vehicles. 2 other wounded comrades were placed into vehicles by the rest of the squad, and then they all climbed aboard to ferry them back to the next defensive position. Over the next couple of days, the area would be fought over relentlessly as the Chinese sought to break out of the Los Angeles basin. The outcome was certainly not clear-cut. Nogales, Arizona. Chad looked at the 2 guys before him with a scrutinizing stare. The man on the right, Jose, looked to be in his early 20s. The other guy, Todd, had to be pushing 50. They had both been recommended to him by a trusted friend in the Arizona Minutemen group. After motioning for the 2 of them to take a seat, Chad asked, "Why do you want to fight the Chinese?" The younger guy, Jose, had a quizzical look on his face. He glanced at the older man to his left. Is that some sort of trick question? Just answer the question, Jose, Chad responded. He put his pen down and crossed his arms, waiting for his answer. A smirk spread across the young man's face. To kill Chinese. Why else? Chad smiled at the answer, then reached for his glass of water. He took a couple of sips before placing it back on the table. Okay, Jose, thank you for the honest answer, he replied. Then he turned to Todd. Same question. Why do you want to fight the Chinese? Without missing a beat, Todd explained, Because they killed my wife and son? Now my daughter is missing, and I'm afraid they have either snatched her or killed her too. He's the one I'm going to train, Chad thought. Thank you both for your honesty. Unfortunately, I can only train one of you, Chad said. So I have one last question. Have either of you ever worked with explosives or had any electrical training? Jose answered first. I used to work at Best Buy. I was part of the Geek Squad, so I used to do a lot of work on computers and things like that. Todd added, I did a stint in the Rangers during the First Gulf War. Got out in '95 as a staff sergeant. Before the war, I worked as an OTR driver for a trucking company here in Arizona. I know just about every road there is around here. What did you do in the Rangers? Asked Chad, his interest piqued. I was a demo guy. Furrowing his brow, Chad followed up. Why did you leave the Army and become a truck driver? Nothing personal, just trying to figure you out. I saw a few too many of my buddies get killed in Somalia. I liked driving trucks, and frankly, it's not bad pay, especially when your wife is pretty frugal with money. Fair enough, Chad replied. Okay, I wasn't expecting to have two guys who I could reasonably train, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make an exception and train you both. From now on, you guys belong to me. You go where I tell you to go, and you do what I tell you to do. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to teach you guys how to build IEDs. I'm going to teach you how to build car bombs, and more importantly, I'm going to teach you how to not get caught. You both come highly recommended, so don't screw that up by proving them wrong. And don't make me look bad for choosing you, Chad explained. He wanted them to understand that people had put their reputations on the line for them, and he was taking a risk by agreeing to teach them his trade. Jose raised his hand to ask a question. Go ahead, Jose. If you don't mind me asking, what's your background? How'd you learn how to build IEDs? Chad pulled his grunt-style t-shirt sleeve up and showed them a tattoo on his right upper arm. It was a tattoo of a trident and a frog's bones. 20 years in the teams. Jose quickly replied, I was told you worked for Customs and Border Patrol. Chad laughed. I did. I retired from the Navy 4 years ago. I double-dip now. I'm working on that second government pension. For the rest of the day, Chad's plan of action was mostly to get to know his new apprentices. He needed to make sure his gut reaction was correct, and that these two men would have the right mindset to handle something so deadly. One day this war would end, and bomb-making wasn't exactly a marketable skill. He wanted to make sure he wasn't training future Unabombers or something. The following morning, Chad woke them both up at 0600 hours. They did some morning PT, which consisted of 50 reps of front-back goes. They each did 5 push-ups, then rolled over to their back, did 30 seconds of flutter kicks, then jumped to their feet and held their hands out in front of them and ran in place for 30 seconds. Then, they repeated the entire process 49 more times. Chad didn't have a lot of space to exercise, so he had to make do. When the Chinese had nuked Yuma at the outset of the war, they'd wiped out the bulk of the military force in the state. With that gaping power vacuum and a heavy cruise missile attack that devastated Fort Huachuca and David Monthan Air Force Base, there wasn't much left to slow the Chinese advance. They captured most of Arizona in one fell swoop. However, some of the remaining U.S. Army units stayed behind enemy lines to work with the local militia units. When it became clear they'd be running an insurgency operation, the local militia and army units opted to take advantage of all the vacant mines around the Huachuca Mountains. Chad, being one of the most important guys in the militia for his bomb-making skills, had been given a nice cave to work his magic. It was a deep cave, deeper than Chad had explored or cared to explore for the time being. He'd set up his little bomb-making shop, probably about half a mile inside, far enough away that he could detect if someone entered the cave and was approaching him, but close enough that it wouldn't take him half a day to get out. The only drawback to working this deep in a cave was carrying the IED materials in and out, along with food and other resources he needed. He was fortunate, though. Toward the end of the little space he'd taken over was an opening in the mountain above. It wasn't very big, maybe 2 inches wide, but it provided some natural light, and when it rained, which wasn't often, it allowed water in. But more importantly, it created a steady flow of air that moved through the cave. Chad didn't live alone. 4 militiamen had been assigned to protect him, and he already had one bomb-making assistant before he'd added these 2 new trainees. Once in a blue moon, his cave would be used as a shelter for one of the militia's roving patrols, but they mostly stayed near the entrance. Once Chad exited the cave, he had to hike about a quarter mile down a trail until he came to a dirt road that cut through the mountain. It was an improvised road the Customs and Border Patrol would use from time to time when they needed to travel through parts of the mountain range during their patrols. That was where Chad's assistant would bring the IEDs to be picked up by one of the militia units. They'd pick them up in a truck, by horseback, or sometimes on foot, and take them to either Nogales or Sierra Vista, where they'd use them against the Chinese. So far, they'd done quite a bit to make things as difficult for the Chinese soldiers as possible. Okay, for today's lesson, I'm going to teach you how to make a heat-sensitive infrared triggering device. Chad announced as he held one up in his hand. Can you tell me what's different about a heat-sensitive IR device versus just a regular IR device? The sensitive one allows you to set what temperature you want it to activate at, Todd replied confidently. Chad smiled. Exactly. You see, Jose, we don't want this bad boy to go off when it detects a person walking by, or even when a car or truck drives past it. We want it to go off when one of those heavy diesel engines the PLA use in their vehicles passes by. This is essentially the same thing that was done to us in Iraq and Afghanistan. A car or truck could drive past it all day long, but once the IR sensor detected something that went above its temperature threshold, it went off. That's what I'm going to teach you guys to build. Once we crank out a couple dozen of them, I'll show you how we construct the actual IEDs, Chad concluded before beginning his demonstration. If all went well, then in 2 or 3 weeks, he'd have 2 more competent bomb-making assistants. In a couple of months, he'd graduate these guys, and they'd go start another bomb-making cell somewhere else in the occupied zones. Until then, they'd help him crank out IEDs as fast as they safely could. Interstate 19 was about to get a lot more dangerous for the Chinese and their allies.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.